The sun was a hammer, and the dusty platform of Jericho Springs was the anvil. It beat upon Mei-Ling's silk-clad shoulders, a cruel and insistent rhythm that promised to pound her spirit into the same fine, red dust that coated everything. The dress, a vibrant emerald meant for gasplit parlors and cool evening breezes, felt like a costume for a tragic play she had never auditioned for. It clung to her with the clammy persistence of sweat and fear, its fine threads a mockery of the life she had been promised, a life that now seemed as distant and imagined as the cool green hills of her homeland. She was a porcelain doll set down in a smithy, waiting for the first errant spark to set her alight or the first careless blow to shatter her completely. Around her, the town breathed a thick stew of stale whiskey, sweat, and desperation. The air, shimmering with heat, carried the clang of a distant blacksmith, the shrill laughter of a saloon girl, and the low, predatory murmur of men whose eyes lingered on her like carrion birds sizing up a meal. She kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the warped wooden planks beneath her feet, a tiny, jagged canyon in her desolate new world. She had been told to wait. A Mr. Silas Stone, had assured her father's creditor that a prosperous American merchant, a man of means, would be here to meet her. The debt would be settled. Her family would be safe. And she would be the currency, a living, breathing piece of fine china, traded for columns of numbers in a ledger. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were clenched so tightly that her fingernails, once polished and perfect, bit into her palms. The pain was a small, sharp anchor in the swirling sea of her anxiety. She had been traveling for what felt like a lifetime. First, the suffocating belly of a ship, a rolling, groaning prison of salt and sorrow. Then, the chattering, rattling spine of the train, which had spit her out into this furnace. With each mile, the world had grown wider, emptier, and more hostile. The green of her home had bled away, replaced by the relentless beige and ochre of this alien land. The very sky seemed too large, too vacant, an indifferent blue eye staring down at her insignificance. The station master, a man whose face was a road map of sunburn and suspicion, had pointed her to this bench hours ago and then retreated into the shade of his office, leaving her to bake. Men in dusty boots and sweat-stained hats had come and gone, collecting parcels and mail, their glances a mixture of crude curiosity and contempt. She felt their thoughts like insects crawling on her skin. She was an oddity, a splash of impossible color in their monochrome existence. An object. That was the word that echoed in the hollow space behind her ribs. An object to be claimed. As the sun began its slow, merciless descent toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains, a new kind of fear began to prickle at her. The fear of abandonment. What if no one came? What if the promise was a lie, and she was simply left here, a piece of unclaimed freight? The thought was a cold stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. To be left here, in this place, with no name, no money, and no language to beg for mercy. It was a fate worse than any she had imagined. She drew in a shaky breath, the hot, dusty air scorching her lungs. She would not cry. Tears were a luxury, a waste of precious water she did not have. She had a promise to keep, a family to save, even if it meant being sold. Her resolve was a tiny, flickering candle in the vast darkness of her fear, but it was all she had. She would hold on to it until her last breath. The sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, and still she waited. The last of the daylight was being devoured by the horizon when the wagon appeared. It did not arrive with the jangling importance of a merchant's carriage, but with the weary, lumbering gait of a beast of burden at the end of a long day. It was little more than a wooden box on wheels, pulled by a single, haggard-looking mule. The man holding the reins was a silhouette against the dying light, a figure carved from the same rough material as the land itself. As he drew closer, the silhouette resolved into a man who seemed to have been aged by the sun and wind rather than by years. He was not the prosperous merchant of her desperate hopes. There was no fine coat, no polished boots, no air of comfortable wealth. His clothes were functional, faded denim, and canvas worn thin in places, and patched in others. A layer of red dust coated him from the brim of his battered hat to the heels of his scuffed boots, making him appear as if he had been sculpted from the very earth he stood upon. He pulled the wagon to a halt a respectful distance away, the only sound the creak of the leather and the tired sigh of the mule. He did not get down immediately. He just sat there, watching her. Mei-Ling felt his gaze, and it was different from the others. It was not leering or contemptuous. It was heavy, quiet, and appraising, like a man judging the grain of a piece of wood or the heft of a stone. There was a stillness about him, an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived without waste. His face, when he finally turned it into the last vestiges of light from the station lamp, was a landscape of its own. High cheekbones, a strong jawline shadowed by a day's worth of stubble, and eyes that were the color of a stormy sky. They were eyes that had seen too much and said too little. They held a deep, unshakable sadness that resonated with the ache in her own chest. He finally swung down from the wagon, his movements fluid and sure. He was taller than she had expected and broader in the shoulders. He walked not with a swagger, but with a slow, deliberate stride that seemed to measure the ground before him. He stopped before her, the dusty space between them crackling with a tension that was thicker than the evening heat. He took off his hat, a gesture that seemed to cost him some effort, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached straw. He held the hat in both hands, turning the brim over and over. The station master reappeared from his office, a piece of paper in his hand, and a look of sour finality on his face. He walked over to the silent man, not to her. "Caleb," he grunted, shoving the paper forward. "This is the consignment, as per the arrangement with Mr. Stone." The word consignment hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Mei-Ling flinched as if struck. The man named Caleb did not look at the station master. His gaze remained on her, his expression unreadable. He reached out and took the paper. His hands were large, calloused, and scarred, the hands of a man who worked, and worked hard. He did not read the paper. He simply folded it once, twice, and tucked it into the pocket of his shirt. Then he spoke, and his voice was what she should have expected. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a voice that had been used so little it had rusted. "The wagon," he said. It was not a question or a request. It was a simple statement of fact, a new reality. He gestured with his head toward the back of the simple cart. There was no seat for a passenger. There was only a collection of burlap sacks, a water barrel, and the hard wooden bed of the wagon itself. This was the first test. She could protest, could cling to the tatters of her imagined dignity, and demand the comfort she was not going to receive, or she could accept. She looked from his impassive face to the crude wagon, then back to the darkening, hostile street of Jericho Springs. There was no choice, not really. There was only the illusion of one. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Mei-Ling gathered the folds of her ridiculous emerald dress, rose from the bench, and walked toward the wagon. She did not look back. She did not wait for him to help her. With a grace born of desperation, she placed one hand on the rough wooden side, hoisted herself up, and settled onto a coarse burlap sack, filled with what felt like grain. She sat straight-backed, her chin held high, a silent queen on a throne of animal feed. She felt his eyes on her, and for the first time, she thought she detected a flicker of something in their depths. It was not kindness, not yet. But it was not contempt either. It was, perhaps, a sliver of reluctant respect. With a soft click of his tongue and a gentle shake of the reins, Caleb set the mule into motion. The wagon lurched forward, and the town of Jericho Springs began to fall away behind them. The weak yellow lights of the saloon and the station master's office shrank into pinpricks, then vanished entirely, swallowed by the immense, ink-black curtain of the night. The cacophony of the town was replaced by a new set of sounds. The rhythmic clopping of the mule's hooves, the steady creak and groan of the wooden wagon, and the whisper of a rising wind through the sparse, skeletal brush. The world dissolved into darkness, leaving only the three of them, a silent man, a frightened woman, and a tired animal, moving as a single entity through the vast, empty wilderness. The landscape that revealed itself with the gray light of dawn was more terrifying than the darkness had been. It was a world stripped to its bones. Under a sky the color of faded pewter, the land stretched out in every direction, a rolling sea of rock and dust and thorny vegetation. Great mesas and buttes stood like ancient, forgotten gods on the horizon, their faces scarred and weathered by eons of wind and sun. There was no softness here, no gentle curve or welcoming shade. Every line was sharp, every surface hostile. The land did not invite life, it dared it to exist. It was a place that could swallow a person whole, leaving not even a memory behind. It mirrored the desolation in her own heart, making her feel profoundly, terrifyingly small. For hours, they traveled in a silence that was as vast and unforgiving as the landscape. Caleb never spoke. His attention was fixed on the trail ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the rocks, the sky. He was a part of this place, his stillness a reflection of the patient, watchful mountains. Mei-Ling watched him from her perch in the back of the wagon. She observed the way his hands held the reins, firm but gentle. She noted the subtle shift of his weight as he navigated a treacherous patch of ground, the way his head tilted at the distant cry of a hawk. He was as competent and as quiet as a predator in his own territory. He moved with a purpose and an understanding of this harsh world that was both frightening and, in a strange way, reassuring. He was a man who knew how to survive. She, in turn, endured. The jolting of the wagon was a constant, bruising assault. Every muscle in her body ached. The sun, now fully risen, began its daily assault, and the fine silk of her dress became a cage of heat. Her throat was a desert, and her lips were cracked and dry. Yet she did not complain. She did not make a sound. She bit down on her discomfort, packed it away with her fear and her grief, and presented a mask of calm endurance. Complaining would be a weakness, a sign that she was as fragile as she looked. She would not give him that. She would be as still and as silent as he was. It was the only language they seemed to share. Sometime around midday, when the sun was a white hot coin directly overhead, he pulled the wagon to a halt in the meager shade of a cluster of monolithic red rocks. Without a word, he got down, unhitched the mule, and led it to a small canvas bucket of water. Only after the animal had drunk its fill did he turn his attention to himself. He uncorked a large canteen, drank deeply, and then splashed water over his face and neck. He stood for a moment, letting the coolness brace him, and then he turned toward the wagon. He walked over, holding out the canteen to her. Mei-Ling stared at the battered tin canteen. It was a simple object, but in that moment, it felt like a profound offering. He had tended to his animal first, then himself, and now her. A clear, unspoken order of priorities. It was a gesture of provision, not of kindness, but it was more than she had expected. She hesitated for only a second before reaching out to take it. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the rough, calloused warmth of his skin. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a strange jolt through her. She lifted the canteen to her lips. The water was cool and tasted faintly of metal and earth. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, not wanting to seem greedy. When she was finished, she wiped her lips and handed it back to him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Gigi, she whispered, the words a foreign pebble in the vast silence. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, took the canteen, and turned away to retie the mule. The conversation was over, but something had shifted. A single drop of water had fallen on the parched ground of their acquaintance. As the sun began to dip low again, casting long, distorted shadows that made the rocks look like crouching beasts, a change occurred in the landscape. The terrain began to rise, climbing toward a long, high ridge that cut across the horizon like a jagged scar. The trail grew steeper and more difficult, and Caleb got down from the wagon to walk alongside the struggling mule, his hand often on its flank, his low voice a rumbling murmur of encouragement. Mei-Ling watched the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch and release as he helped push the wagon over particularly rough spots. He was tireless, a man made of sinew and quiet determination. They crested the hill just as the last of the light bled from the sky, and there, laid out below them, was his world. Mei-Ling's breath caught in her throat. She had been steeling herself for a miserable hovel, a dirt-floored shack that would confirm her worst fears. What she saw was something else entirely. Tucked into a protective bowl of land, sheltered by the ridge they had just climbed, was a small, thriving valley. It was a secret patch of green in a world of red and brown. A creek lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered silver in the twilight snaked through the valley floor. It fed a series of neatly irrigated fields, already showing the green promise of crops. A sturdy, well-built barn stood beside a fenced corral holding several healthy-looking horses, and nestled under the protective arm of a massive oak tree was the house. It was not a mansion, not the home of a wealthy merchant. It was a simple cabin, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke was already rising. It was small, solid, and exuded a sense of permanence. It was a house that had been built to withstand storms. But that was not what made her gasp. A little ways off from the main cabin, set apart but clearly part of the homestead, was a second smaller cabin. It was a mirror of the main house, just as solid, just as carefully built. A light flickered in its single window. Caleb led the wagon down the gentle slope, the silence of the valley wrapping around them like a blanket. He brought the wagon to a stop not before the main house, but between the two cabins. He unhitched the mule and led it toward the barn without a word. Mei-Ling sat frozen, unsure of what to do. He had not pointed to the main house. He had not claimed her for it. Her mind raced with confusion. Was the smaller cabin for a servant? Was he not the master of this place? He returned from the barn after a few moments. He walked not to her, but to the door of the smaller cabin. He pushed it open, and the warm yellow light of a lantern spilled out. He turned and looked at her, still sitting in the wagon. Then he did something that fundamentally altered the landscape of her fear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy, iron key. He set it down on the porch of the small cabin, just inside the open door. Then he gestured toward the cabin, a simple, open-handed motion. It was an invitation, an offering of sanctuary. Slowly, her limbs stiff and aching, Mei-Ling climbed down from the wagon. She walked toward the small cabin, as if in a dream. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and beeswax. A small fire was already crackling merrily in the stone fireplace. A simple wooden bed was neatly made in the corner, with a thick wool blanket folded at its foot. On a small table, there was a pitcher of water, a loaf of bread, and a bowl of what looked like stew, still steaming. He had prepared this. He had anticipated her arrival and provided for her comfort and her privacy. She turned and looked back at him. He stood in the twilight, his form a dark, solid shape against the deepening purple of the sky. He had not followed her. He had not crossed the threshold. He simply watched, his face in shadow. She looked at the key glinting on the porch floor. She looked at the sturdy wooden door, and she understood. The lock was for the inside. He was not giving her a prison. He was giving her a choice. He was giving her a space that was hers, a door she could close, a world she could shut out. In a life where every choice had been taken from her, this silent, stoic man had just handed one back. With a trembling hand, she reached down, picked up the key, and quietly closed the door. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as silent and steady as a heartbeat. A pattern of provision was established, a language spoken without words. Every morning, when Mei-Ling awoke, she would find a bucket of fresh milk and a small basket of eggs on her porch. Sometimes there would be a freshly caught rabbit or a brace of quail, cleaned and ready for the pot. He left these offerings at dawn, moving with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, never waiting for her to emerge, never seeking thanks or acknowledgement. His presence was marked only by the gifts he left behind. From the single window of her cabin, which she soon began to think of as her home, she watched him. His life was a testament to relentless work. He rose before the sun and did not stop until long after it had set. He mended fences, tended his crops, cared for his animals, and worked the small forge he had built near the barn, the ring of his hammer, a constant rhythmic punctuation to the day. He moved with an unwavering purpose, a man at war with the entropy of the wilderness, and he was winning. The valley was his creation, a small kingdom of order and life carved out of the surrounding chaos. Her fear of him, a sharp and constant thing at first, slowly began to change. It softened, evolving from the terror of a captive into the analytical observation of a survivor. She noted things he probably thought no one saw. She saw the way his large, rough hands could be surprisingly gentle as he reset the wing of an injured bird he found. She watched him stand for long moments by the creek, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lost in the running water, a profound melancholy settling over him like a shroud. She saw him talking to his horses, his low, rumbling voice softer and warmer than when he had spoken to her. He was a man of deep, hidden currents, his stoic surface hiding a well of sorrow she could only guess at. Within the four walls of her cabin, Mei-Ling began to reclaim herself. The emerald silk dress was carefully washed and put away, a relic of a former life. She found a pair of old trousers and a shirt of Caleb's in a storage chest, and after cutting and resewing them to fit her smaller frame, she had clothes that were practical, clothes that allowed her to move and to work. She was no longer a porcelain doll. She was a woman learning to live in a new world. She swept her small home, she cooked her meals, she washed her clothes in the creek. These simple acts of domesticity were not acts of subservience, they were acts of defiance. They were her way of imposing her own order on her small corner of the universe, of declaring that she was a person, not a piece of property. One afternoon, while exploring the creek bed, her fingers closed around a piece of soft, pliable clay. She took it back to her cabin. As the days passed, in the quiet hours after her chores were done, she began to shape it. Her fingers remembered the lessons of her grandfather, a humble potter. She worked the clay, her mind quiet, her hands moving with an instinct she thought she had forgotten. Slowly, a shape emerged, a small, graceful bird, its head cocked as if listening for a song. She let it dry on her window sill, and when it was hard, she spent hours polishing it with a smooth stone until it had a soft, dull sheen. Section. The next morning, she waited. She sat by her window, the small clay bird held carefully in her hands. When she saw Caleb approaching with the morning's milk, her heart began to beat a little faster. This was a risk. This was crossing a boundary. He set the pail down on the porch as usual and turned to leave. Before he could, she opened her door. He stopped, his back to her, every line of his body tense, as if expecting a blow. She stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He turned slowly. It was the first time they had faced each other in weeks. His eyes, stormy and unreadable, met hers. She saw a flicker of surprise in them. She held out her hand, the clay bird resting in her palm. "For you," she said. It was not a payment. It was not a bribe. It was an offering. A small, fragile piece of herself. A declaration that she had a skill, a past, a soul. It was a bridge across the silent chasm between them. He stared at the bird, then at her face, then back at the bird. For a long moment, he did not move. She thought he would refuse it, that he would turn and walk away, leaving her standing there with her foolish, hopeful gesture. Then, with a slowness that seemed to hold the weight of the world, he reached out his large, calloused hand. His fingers, which could mend a fence or shoe a horse with such brutal efficiency, were impossibly gentle as he plucked the tiny bird from her palm. He held it, turning it over and over, examining the smooth lines, the delicate shape. He did not speak, but as he stood there in the early morning light, holding her small gift, she saw the hard lines of his face soften, just for a second. He closed his fingers around the bird, gave her a single deep nod, and then turned and walked away toward the fields, the clay bird still clutched in his hand. A week later, he performed the act that truly set her free. It was evening, and she was washing her dinner plate in the creek when he approached. It was the first time he had sought her out. He stopped a few feet away, holding a familiar, folded piece of paper in his hand. It was the consignment note from Jericho Springs, the deed that declared her his property. He also held a small lit taper. Without a word, he knelt by the water's edge. He held the corner of the paper to the flame. It caught, and the fire began to eat away at the damning words, turning them to black ash. He held it until the flames licked at his fingertips, and then he let the last glowing embers fall into the creek, where they hissed and died. He looked at her then, the flickering light of the dying fire dancing in his gray eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was still rough, but the rust had been scraped away, leaving something stronger and clearer underneath. "You are not a consignment," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You are not a debt. This is your home, for as long as you choose it. The trail back to Jericho is long, and winter is coming, but you are free to walk it, if you wish." He stood up, and for the first time, he used her name, which he must have read on the paper before he burned it. "You are free, Mei-Ling." And then he turned and walked back to his own cabin, leaving her by the creek with the ghost of the fire and the sudden, staggering weight of a choice that was finally, truly her own. The first snow fell, not with a fury, but with a quiet, solemn grace, dusting the valley in a blanket of pristine white. The world shrank. the horizon drawing in until their small homestead felt like the only place on earth. The cold forced a change in their silent routine. It was no longer practical for her to live in the small cabin, with its less efficient fireplace and its distance from the well in the barn. The threat was no longer human avarice, but the indifferent cruelty of nature itself. The cold was a predator, and it was stalking them both. One morning, after a particularly bitter night, Caleb appeared at her door, not with milk, but with his arms full of firewood. He did not leave it on the porch. He knocked, the solid, deliberate sound. When she opened the door, he stood there, flakes of snow melting in his hair, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The main house is warmer," he said. It was not a command. It was a statement of irrefutable fact, an offering of shared warmth against a common enemy. "The loft is yours. It is dry." She did not hesitate. She packed her few belongings, the mended clothes, her polishing stone, a few other small treasures she had collected, into a simple bundle. He carried her bedding. The walk between the two cabins, a distance she had crossed 1,000 times, felt different. It was a journey from one life to another. Crossing the threshold of his home was crossing a line she had never thought she would breach. The inside of his cabin was as Spartan and as functional as the man himself. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a long wooden table and two chairs stood in the center, and a simple bed occupied a corner. Everything was clean, worn, and intensely personal. The small clay bird she had made him sat on the mantelpiece, a small silent testament in the heart of his home. He led her to a sturdy ladder that went up to a sleeping loft. As he had said, it was warm and dry, the heat from the fireplace rising to fill the space. A straw-filled mattress and a stack of thick wool blankets were already there. He had prepared it for her. Once again, he had anticipated her needs and provided for them without question. "Thank you," she said. And this time, the words felt full and real, not the hollow pebbles they had been before. He just nodded and went back down the ladder, leaving her to settle into her new space. The physical and emotional distance between them had shrunk from the width of a valley to the space of a single room. The blizzard arrived 2 days later. It did not come quietly. It descended from the mountains like a howling wolf, a screaming white fury that erased the world. The wind shrieked and clawed at the cabin, and the snow fell so thick and fast that the barn, only 50 yards away, was completely invisible. They were trapped, isolated from the world, sealed in the small warm bubble of the cabin. The forced proximity should have been awkward, but it was not. The shared threat of the storm forged a new kind of intimacy between them, an alliance against the raging elements. Their days became a shared rhythm of survival. He would brave the blinding snow to feed the animals in the barn, returning covered in ice, his face raw from the wind. She would have hot coffee ready for him, and a bowl of stew warming by the fire. He taught her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. She, in turn, found a stash of his worn-out shirts, and with her small sewing kit, began to mend them, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to his rough bachelor's repairs. They spoke little, but their actions became a conversation. He would chop wood, she would make bread. He would check the security of the roof, she would ensure the water barrels were full of melted snow. They were a team, their movements complementing each other in the small space, a silent, efficient dance of mutual reliance. One evening, as the storm raged its fiercest, a sound from the barn cut through the howl of the wind. It was a sound of animal distress, sharp and pained. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his face grim. "One of the mares," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "She's foaling. Too early." Without thinking, Mei-Ling was right behind him, grabbing her own coat. "I'm coming with you," she said. It was not a request. He looked at her, about to object, but saw the resolve in her eyes. It was the same look she had worn on the wagon, the same look she had when she'd offered him the bird. He gave a single, curt nod. He grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope, and together, they stepped out into the white chaos. The journey to the barn was a battle. The wind tore at them, and the snow was a blinding, suffocating wall. Caleb went first, a solid anchor against the storm's fury, the rope connecting them a lifeline. When they finally stumbled into the relative quiet of the barn, they were both gasping for breath, their clothes frozen stiff. In a large stall, one of the mares was down, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain and fear. The foal was coming. but it was breach. Caleb cursed under his breath, his face a mask of worry. This was his livelihood. More than that, these animals were his family. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, his low voice trying to soothe the terrified mare. Mei-Ling did not stand by helplessly. She saw his hands were shaking from the cold. She filled buckets with snow and started a small controlled fire in the forge to melt it for warm water. She tore strips from a clean blanket to use as towels. She anticipated his needs, handing him tools, holding the lantern steady, her presence a small calm island in the storm of the difficult birth. For hours they worked, side by side, their breath mingling in the cold air, their hands brushing as they fought to save the mare and her foal. They were no longer a man and a woman from different worlds. They were two people fighting for a single life. Just before dawn, as the storm outside began to lose its fury, their efforts were rewarded. With a final heroic push from the mare and Caleb's skilled guidance, a tiny slick foal tumbled onto the straw. It was alive, weak, but alive. Exhausted, Caleb sank back against the wall of the stall. Mei-Ling, her face smudged with dirt and her clothes stained, worked quickly to rub the foal with a dry cloth, stimulating its circulation until it gave a weak, bleeding cry and tried to struggle to its feet. A smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen, broke across Caleb's tired face. It transformed him, chasing away the shadows and revealing the man he might have been before sorrow had carved its lines so deeply into him. They sat in the quiet of the barn, the only sounds the contented nicker of the new mother and the soft sigh of the dying wind. The crisis was over. They had won. Caleb looked over at her, his gray eyes soft in the lantern light. I couldn't have done it without you, he said, his voice raw with exhaustion and something else, something deeper, gratitude. He looked down at his scarred hands, then back up at her. It's been a long time since there was anyone. The words hung in the air, a vulnerable confession. He was speaking of more than just the foal. He was speaking of the silence, the solitude, the crushing weight of his lonely existence. He hesitated, then continued, his voice barely a whisper. I had a wife, Sarah, and a little girl, Lily. He stared at a point in the middle distance, seeing a past she could only imagine. There was a fever that swept through the valley years ago. I was away trading for supplies. By the time I got back, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The raw, unhealed pain of it was etched on his face. I built this place for them. This valley was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where nothing could touch them. He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I thought I was just building a farm. I ended up building a tomb. Mei-Ling's heart ached for him. She saw it all now, the sadness in his eyes, the fierce protection of his land, the walls he had built around his heart. They were not to keep others out. They were to keep his grief in. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. It was a simple, comforting gesture. He flinched at the contact, as if unused to any form of touch, but he did not pull away. He looked down at her small hand on his rough canvas sleeve, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. They sat there in the quiet dawn, two survivors in a barn, their shared grief and their shared triumph, a fragile newborn thing between them, as precious and as vulnerable as the foal sleeping in the straw. The walls had not just been breached, they had begun to dissolve. The storm passed, leaving the world transformed. The valley was a pristine bowl of white, the sun glittering on the snow-laden branches of the trees, making them look as if they were coated in diamonds. The air was clean and cold and sharp, and the silence that descended was not one of emptiness, but of peace. The immediate danger was gone, but the world inside the cabin had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The invisible line that had separated the loft from the ground floor, the master of the house from his guest, had vanished. Mei-Ling did not move her things back to the small cabin. Neither of them ever mentioned it. It simply became an accepted fact. She belonged in the main house now. Her presence softened the cabin's hard masculine edges. A jar of winter wildflowers appeared on the table. The curtains she sewed from old flour sacks, embroidered with a simple, elegant pattern, brought a touch of grace to the windows. The smell of baking bread and savory herbs began to mingle with a familiar sense of wood smoke and leather. The house, which had been a shelter for a man's grief, was slowly becoming a home for two people. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of the storm, became the new language of their lives. It was a language spoken in shared tasks and comfortable silences. He taught her how to track rabbits in the snow, his large hands patiently guiding hers as he showed her how to read the subtle signs of the wilderness. She, in turn, discovered his small, neglected garden under the snow, and using seeds she had carefully carried all the way from her home, planned a spring planting that promised flavors and colors this valley had never known. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a rhythm developed through shared hardship and mutual respect. One afternoon, he was at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing through the quiet valley. She brought him a mug of hot cider, a ritual she had started during the blizzard. He stopped his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He took the mug, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He took a long drink, his eyes watching her over the rim of the mug. "This place is different with you in it," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. He looked around the valley, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the horses in the corral, at the snow-covered fields. "I had forgotten what it was like to have a light in the window." He set the mug down and picked up a piece of iron he had been working on. It was a simple fire poker, but he had hammered a small, delicate twist into the handle, a touch of artistry that was completely unnecessary for its function. He held it out to her. It was still warm from the forge. "Everything I have built," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "It was just things, wood and stone. You are the fire." It was the closest he had ever come to a declaration, a simple, understated confession that held the weight of his entire world. She took the poker from him, its warmth spreading through her hand, and in the quiet of the snow-covered valley, she knew she was home. The journey had been long and terrifying, but it had led her here. She was no longer an object, no longer a consignment, no longer an outsider. She was the fire, and she was free.